Thank you, Lefteris. Kalimera. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, thank you again, Lefteris, Helen, and to the organizing committee of the ECER conference for this kind invitation. It's a big honor and a big responsibility to be here with you, because this is, to me, this is one of the reference conferences and associations with many colleagues I respect and I attend regularly. So I am very happy to share with you my reflections on education policy research in the last years. And initially I wanted to talk about the micro foundations of policy change, but I have widening the scope of my talk to talk more about mechanism-based explanations that of course include micro foundations, but not only, because I think it fits better with the way I do research, with the way I understand education policy change. So in today's presentation, I want to talk you, well, first I will start by giving some considerations on policy change in the current context, so how changing political dynamics are influencing policy change, but also the way we analyze, understand policy change. Then at the center of my presentation, I want to share with you my conceptual toolkit. I will have to define what I understand by policy change, but also what are social mechanisms, which type of social mechanisms can be useful to understand policy change. And my main point here is that the best and the most useful theories about education policy change are those that combine different types of mechanisms. And if I have time, which I hope so, I will share with you some empirical data on how we are using this type of approach in the context of the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and in particular in the context of the Reformed project, which Lefteris was referring to. So, let me start by talking about some political developments that are influencing policy change. I think that policy movement dynamics have been, especially since the 90s, seen as the consequence of well-defined centers of power, sometimes international organizations, but also the most powerful countries, usually Western countries, spreading global ideas about good education and good education policy in particular. But there are some political trends that are challenging this premise. The first is what is called the liberal values backlash. So we are witnessing the emergence of far-right political movements that are also capitalizing, in a way, political parties and winning, actually, political elections in many Western countries, with a very different approach to the one that, I don't know, in world culture theory, but also in critical approaches, understood global education. So these are not movements that are spreading liberal democracy, human rights, gender equality, sustainability, and so on, but rather the opposite. So I think it's particularly striking that these movements are particularly strong in Western countries, in North America, but also in, as I said, in European countries, that were those disseminating these values that were penetrating educational policies. So this is, I would say, the first political development I want to highlight. The second is that it's not clear that when it comes to the governance of education, the dominant paradigm is still neoliberalism, in the sense that understanding neoliberalism at least as austerity and deregulation. I think that the last pandemic crisis shows that, at least in Europe, we learned the lessons from the financial crisis, and that we are not promoting austerity policies anymore as a way to counterbalance the crisis, but Rather, we are going for, at least, as I said, in European countries, counter-cyclical policies. And also, as I will develop below, it's not clear that deregulation is the way governments are responding to new global problems, rather the opposite, through more public regulation and the expansion of state capacities. And the third characteristic is the increasing presence of international actors in the global education policy field, something that Elfert and ECER are defining as multi-stakeholderism in the field of global education policy. So an increasing number of international organizations, but also non-state-based international actors, philanthropic foundations, international funds, public-private partnerships. International organizations are not only growing, but are also becoming more complex, with countries that were more passive participants claiming more voice. And as a result, the agendas, the education agendas of these actors are becoming more pluralistic and more complex. I think that this figure is quite useful to show the rise of international organizations. This is the work by Niemann and Martens that basically show the increase of state-based international organizations focusing on education. And as you can see, the numbers have increased exponentially since the constitution of the post-Second World War international political architecture. And of course, these numbers would be much higher if we include, as I said before, international funds, philanthropic organizations, which also have a voice and particular ideas about how education policy should be done. There's another phenomenon I want to highlight, and I think is important to say that today we live in increasingly complex, interdependent societies in which governments, especially democratic governments, need to face new problems. In education, for instance, we are talking about the need to address social inclusion in increasingly polarized societies, cultural diversity, the pressure to digitalize education, addressing learning gaps, bullying problems. So there are so many problems that governments need to address, and they usually do so, as some policy scholars say, through the phenomenon of policy accumulation and growth, which is this tendency of especially democratic societies to accumulate new policy instruments in their policy stock to address these problems and the reform pressures associated to these problems. And this phenomenon is generating some analytical challenges. Well, on the first hand, this idea of policy growth challenges the idea of deregulation as a global trend. Policy accumulation and growth also show that the pattern of policy change is more cumulative than about the substitution of old instruments. This is why they talk about this accumulation in the policy stock. And these authors also highlight the implementation challenges that this phenomenon generates, because the number of policies grows at a higher path than the capacity of states to implement these policies. Although it's also true that through new policies, state capacity is also increasing, but not at the same pathway. They illustrate this phenomenon through different sectoral policies, unfortunately not education. This is the example of what can be done with their database on policy accumulation in the subsystem of social policy. They have done a very similar analysis for what they call moral policy, environmental policy. And as you can see, in most OECD countries, there is an accumulation of policy instrument with the passage of time specifically since the middle of the 70s. And unfortunately, as I said, we don't have this database for education. Hopefully, someone wants to do something similar in the coming years, but we can imagine that something similar is happening in the field of education. So all these trends I am talking about have direct implications for the research we can do on policy change. First, the world is increasingly complex and multipolar. There are global consensus on education policy that are broken. Political ideologies and partisan politics are gaining relevance, as we can see in the cultural wars around the curriculum, around pedagogy and the best ways of instruction in the classroom, tracking policy, school choice, public accountability, the role of the private sector, etc. Of course, education is a big sector with strong structural features, institutional inertia, which make policy change difficult, especially profound policy change. But at the same time, the fact that education is a big sector also involves that there is a lot of public and private funding. Then there are a lot of interest in this sector, specifically economic interest. And I think that the example of the evolution of the tech industry in the promotion of education digitalization is a good example of this type of pressures for change in education also happening at the same time of resilience. And the fact that we have so many stakeholders in talking about education policy, education reform, also makes evident that there is competition for reform ideas and that this type of competition, ideational competition, has intensified. And finally, the fact that state capacity is developing, not only in OECD countries, but also in southern countries, makes us, obliges us to look at endogenous factors of educational change, educational reform. So the main variables that are usually highlighted in policy change research are what is known as the 3 I's, so institutions, interests, and ideas. And I think that public policy analysis is giving a lot of importance to these 3 big dimensions, and they can be very helpful. They look like this when we put them in a sort of research framework. So the 3 I's are sort of drivers of political action that mediate, in a way, these reform pressures and promote policy change. But even if these are the most important, probably, dimensions of policy change, I think it's important to highlight also some limitations of this way of understanding policy change. The first one is probably that research on these factors is trying to tell which I is more important than the other, which I think is an important limitation. And sometimes the I's are artificially separated. For instance, it's very difficult to separate interest from ideas because, in a way, interests are socially constructed. Interpretation is key to make sense of what are my individual and collective interests. This is why I advocate for education policy research that integrates a bit better the 3 I's, but also that unpacks these different drivers of political action. And here is where mechanism-based research, mechanism-based explanation can make sense and actually can come to the rescue of policy analysis in the complex context that we are facing. Now I will define mechanisms, but first I want to define policy change, what some scholars are talking about, the dependent variable problem. So policy change, I could, probably spend the whole conference talking about what can mean policy change, because it's a multidimensional concept. And depending on what is the emphasis, you can have different classifications of policy change. I think it's important to remind us that until the 90s, when Peter Hall made his famous work on paradigmatic change, incrementalism was the main way of understanding policy change. So policy change was the result of the sum of small changes. But Peter Hall came and changed everything, and he demonstrated that policy change is also about paradigmatic change, and that's the most profound level of change. So I have tried to capture in this table the conceptual complexity of the work of this author. Basically, he distinguishes between different orders of change, and each order of change is related to a different level of deepness of this change. So in the third order of change, what are changing are the goals of education and also the logic of the instruments. Not only the instruments are changing, but also why they are being adopted and enacted. In the second order of change, what are changing are not the goals, but at a more intermediate level, the objectives, and also the instruments are being replaced, or new instruments are being adopted. And the most superficial order of change is that in which the settings and the calibration of existing instruments are those that are changing. So the third order of change is usually paradigmatic and is driven by external shocks, according to Peter Hall. And then the second and the first order of change are usually more endogenous in nature and happen through incremental and punctuated equilibriums. Of course, since Peter Hall's work in the middle of the 90s, there are very important theoretical developments challenging these ideas. For instance, Howlett is showing how endogeneity and changes in the instruments, or even in the calibration of instruments, can derive into third order change, into paradigmatic change. And historical institutionalists like Catherine Thelen also show that policy change can happen without formal policy reforms. Changes in the environment can also imply changes in the meaning and in the action of existing policy instruments. So, of course, the debate about policy change is becoming more and more sophisticated. Made this clarification about, policy change can mean very different things at many different levels. I will define the second key concept of my presentation, which is that of social mechanisms. So social mechanisms are probably the most used and abused metaphor in social sciences. So very simply, social mechanisms can be defined as anything that helps to explain how and why a specific social phenomena occur, but I think it's important to be a bit more explicit about what we mean by social mechanisms. And in my presentation, I understand social mechanisms as causal configurations that combine different types of phenomena, entities, structures, but also position practices, power relations, and so on. So the combination of these elements can generate the emergence of phenomena or the promotion of policy change. So there are three main features, at least in a realist understanding of social mechanisms, because the concept of mechanism is also used by economists of education, is also used by psychologists, but in a social science realism, I would say that there are three main features. First, mechanism can generate outcomes. The second is that mechanisms are usually hidden. They are not easy to observe directly through empirical research. So sometimes, of course, we need empirical research, but also we need to resort to theory to have access to what are the causal mechanisms. In this sense, they are not observable events, although observable events can be part of the mechanisms. And finally, mechanisms are sensitive to context and to variations in context. So the same mechanism in a different context can generate different types of outcomes. It's also useful to define mechanisms as what they are not. So they are not only about human psychology, as sometimes analytical sociology tends to reduce the meaning of social mechanisms to human psychology, preferences and biases, etc. And they are not independent variables. They are not independent variables that can be associated to a dependent variable, as the positivist tradition is understanding sometimes mechanisms. Although it's true that mechanisms can explain the relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. In this sense, I think it's important to situate social mechanisms-based explanations in the middle of two main research paradigms. On the one hand, a law-like approach to explanation that is more deterministic in nature and understands causality as event regularities, but also a more interpretativist approach to educational research that adopts usually more ethnographic methods that is content to give voice to subjects but doesn't want to impose an interpretation of these subjects, that is happy with describing rather than on explaining. And I think that mechanism-based explanations are somehow in the middle. Of course, they are in favor of description, thick description, but thick description is the first step towards complex explanations of social phenomena. And this distinction is in a way more ontological and epistemological than methodological in nature, because this type of research is pluralistic in nature. Actually, you can do MBE by doing ethnographic work, discourse analysis, ethnography, and the different methods will help you to do different things. Ethnography to identify mechanisms, but also statistical work to analyze and to see how generally different variables and mechanisms operate. And because of this, this type of research is open to use different sources of data, different methods of data gathering. It doesn't need to rely on standardized databases. Actually, this eclecticism is what makes some scholars to argue that mechanism-based explanations and related methods like process tracing can require a type of detective work. So we need to look for different pieces of evidence to make sense of a particular case. And these particular pieces of evidence can refer to very different types of possible mechanisms, situational, action-oriented, and so on and so forth. Actually, I would like to share with you an ad hoc classification of potential mechanisms of policy change, also to make clear what I'm talking about. So I think we can unpack social mechanisms in 6 broad categories. The first one is what we can call situational mechanisms, which are those that we usually relate to an external shock, an economic crisis, an educational crisis because of PISA has been released, will force educational reform, educational change. The pressures that economic globalization is putting on governments is also a driver, a situational driver of educational reform. Then we have structural types of mechanisms. Here, path dependency is probably the most used for historical institutionalists. So previous policy decisions will affect future decisions. Previous institutions also generate their own constituencies, which make that some policies, sometimes maybe they are not effective, they generate a lot of side effects, but they continue being implemented basically because they have strong constituencies supporting them. Veto points in political architectures, and of course, structural inequalities affecting actors, resources, capacities, and interest would be would be elements and components that are part of this type of structural mechanisms. Then we have, on the other side, more bottom-up mechanisms, which we can call as action-oriented, transformational, which are more about individuals' beliefs, dispositions to action, that when they aggregate, they can produce social outcomes and policy change. So collective action, cognitive processes of a different nature, the presence of policy entrepreneurs in policy subsystems is also one of these key transformational mechanisms. And then we have also relational mechanisms that are very similar to the previous ones, but maybe here we put more emphasis on the interaction between actors in the form of alliances, coalitions, social networks. Here maybe the policy transfer mechanisms that Gita Steiner-Kamshi has worked so much, learning, coercion, normative emulation, competition, would be part of this type of mechanisms through these more networked societies. Cultural and ideational can be both macro and micro. So here there is more and more research on the importance of public opinion, public sentiments as drivers of policy change, especially in democratic societies, the role of persuasion, argumentation, self-fulfilling prophecies, so ideas that maybe they are not true, but the fact that people believe that they are true are having real effects, and of course at a more structural level, social norms, values, the strength or weaknesses of dominating policy paradigms would fit in this fifth category. And then we have evolutionary mechanisms that are more typical in cultural political economy studies, that here maybe they would give more importance to how policies are institutionalized and evolve through time, over time through the processes of variation, selection, and retention. I guess that here the concept of feedback loops is very important. So policies generate politics through different ways. If a policy generates a lot of failure, will generate undermining feedback effects, which will oblige policy change. But if they are not generating these negative effects, maybe they will do the opposite. So they will generate positive feedback and will contribute to policy stability. The fact that policies combine old policies with new policies can generate also bricolage, mixing, and a different type of policy trajectory that sometimes is difficult to predict and to plan from the policy making field, and everything that is considered about policy adaptation to environmental changes would fit in this sixth category. But the point I want to make here is that the most important theories of policy change, or not only theories, but also causal explanations of policy change, need to combine different type of mechanisms, different type of components. And I guess that a good illustration of that can be found in some of the most important theories of policy change. Probably the most cited and well used in industrialized countries is the multiple streams framework. So this idea of Keynote that when the three streams of problem, policy, and politics come together, and usually they come together because of the action of a policy entrepreneur, a policy window opens, and then policy change in the form of agenda setting happens. So this theory combines situational, cultural, action formation, relational, and structural types of mechanisms. There are other two theories that I am not going to develop so much, that are very important also in public policy analysis, like the punctuated equilibrium theory and the advocacy coalition framework, that also rely on different types of mechanisms. So the punctuated equilibrium theory would say that policy change is a pattern that is usually combining long periods of stability with short periods of significant change, what they call punctuations. So different type of mechanisms intervene in this approach, and with the advocacy coalition framework, something similar happens, but here the most important emphasis is on the relational mechanism. So how different actors that share core beliefs and values about policy come together for a long period of time, and they will trigger policy change. So this is a famous theory by Sabatier. And as you can see, all these theories combine different types of mechanisms. In education, we also have this type of theories or scholars in a more bottom-up way trying to theorize about policy change through different mechanisms. For instance, the work on the trajectories of accountability reforms by Christian Marois and Xavier Pons can be useful to illustrate this. So how policy trajectories are the product of the combination of three different mechanisms: path dependence on previous policies, bricolage, understood by them as struggles among actors, but also about how policy innovation is the result of combining ideas from different fields, and the role of policy translation, so how local entrepreneurs translate and vernacularize global education policy trends at the national level. So, and they do a very good, very interesting comparison in Quebec and France, and they show different patterns of accountability reform because of the combination of these three mechanisms. And at a different level, we have been also using very much in the Reformed project the concept of a school's logic of action of Agnes Van Santen, but also the Regular Edu team, including Marois, Stephen Ball. And here, we like this theory because it's talking about how schools respond to market pressure, and sometimes it's assumed that the market is the mechanism, but what they show is that the market in the abstract is not the mechanism. The mechanisms are the combination of the position of schools in the market and the level of turbulence of the market, so if it's more stable or less. So through the combination of these different mechanisms, they show that four school logics of action predominate: entrepreneurial, monopolistic, tactician, and adaptive. So again, a good example of how combining different mechanisms, in this case not found through theory but through empirical research, can help to explain complex social phenomena. And since I have still 10 minutes, I will finish with some empirical illustration of what I have been talking about, and I will focus on the work we have been doing at the Autonomous University of Barcelona on the analysis of the recontextualization and enactment of accountability policies and large-scale assessments in the field of education. So the starting point or the policy focus is that in the last 15, 20 years, the paradigm of a school governance reform has been very much influenced by managerialism, quality assurance instruments, and many governments around the world have embraced this approach that basically combines different policy instruments, and the idea is that policy instruments work as a reform package. So on the one hand, governments want to give more autonomy to educational providers at the same time that they hold these providers accountable on the basis of their performance. And the role of the definition of learning standards in the curriculum, but also the enactment of national large-scale assessment, is clear to combine these two apparently contradictory principles of more autonomy and more accountability and control. So large-scale assessments are probably the instrument, the policy instrument that has spread internationally more quickly in the last 20 years, and of course, one of the instruments that has generated a more passionate debate in policy circles, in academic circles, and so on. Different scholars from different theoretical lenses have been trying to capture this phenomenon of the spread of large-scale assessments, and all of them arrived to a similar conclusion, even in our work, about the expansion of this type of instruments internationally. And the first research intuition that we had when conducting the Reformed project is that, okay, this is a phenomenon that is globalizing, but will be clearly mediated by an entity, an abstract entity that sometimes is difficult to capture and observe, that are the administrative regimes. Because administrative regimes, on the one hand, shape policy implementation, but also how public services are being delivered, assessed, and held accountable. So we thought probably administrative regimes will shape how these larger-scale assessments are used, with how much intensity, and for which purposes. So typical classification of administrative regimes by Guy Peters differentiate between the new public management marketizers, Anglo-American countries and Chile, Germanic countries and Napoleonic countries that are more legalistic type of administrative regimes, the Confucian, which is a category that they use to define the administrative regime in East Asia, and the Nordic, that is basically covering Northern Europe, including Scandinavian countries, with a much more developed welfare state. So we use PISA data because, as you know, a part of the learning results, PISA is also asking school principals what they are doing with different policy instruments, including large-scale assessments. And what we observe is that effectively, when we look in average how the schools of the sample of the different countries, when grouped by administrative regime, the behavior is very different. So the publication of school results data, school achievement data, changes a lot regime by regime, and it's not a surprise that in new public management marketizers, that are those that are promoting a school choice, school performance data is more frequently published. And in legalistic regimes, like the Germanic and the Napoleonic, this practice is more taboo and even banned in many of the countries. If we look at how standardized tests are being used at the school level, for instance, whether they are used to make judgments about teachers' effectiveness, here we find a different picture. Here, Confucian countries outperform, followed by NPM marketizers, and this is a practice that is less common in Nordic, Germanic, and Napoleonic countries. So what we decided to do was to make a small n comparison to go deeper in different cases to understand what's going on in different regulatory contexts with the Reformed project. So we did a small n comparison, and the database is more complete for 3 countries, Norway, Chile, and Catalonia, each of them representing a different administrative regime. Norway, the Nordic; Chile, the NPM marketizer; and Spain as a clear case of a Napoleonic administrative regime. We selected these countries because of the contrasting point of departure and context of reception, but also ex post, we think that there are some reasons to compare these countries, because what we found is that some policy outcomes converge. For instance, high levels of performance pressure is found both in Catalonia and in Chile, but for different reasons. And this is what we also wanted to unpack through qualitative work. So the research objectives were split in two main research strands. On the one hand, we wanted to analyze policy formulation, policy change, policy trajectories. But on the other, we also wanted to understand how policy formulation, so what we found in relation to the first research strand, is also influencing policy implementation and how schools receive this type of policies. Okay, and now, because of, I am not going to abound on methodological questions. If you have any question, I am happy to address them. I will give you the main results of the comparison, basically by building these causal narratives that mechanism-based explanations advocate for. So in Chile, what we find is an incremental pathway, a multi-layered pathway of accountability reform, which goes from market regulation to quality assurance and control. So it's important to say that Chile was an early adopter of large-scale assessments back in the 80s in the context of a very structural market reform. A school choice was promoted, and large-scale assessment were seen as an instrument to inform a school choice. Although this policy was not implemented until the 90s, this was already enacted in the 80s. In the 2000s, there is a new rationale when it comes to reform the quality assurance system and the role of national assessment therein. That is very much about addressing actually market failure, and in a way to see what to do with those schools that are not doing so well, because it's clear that the market is not solving this problem. So higher stakes accountability approach is adopted, with a school autonomy being intervened if schools not perform sufficiently well. A school closure was also a possibility if continuous underperformance was happening. And school performance data is increasingly used to evaluate teachers' work at the school level. So what we observe in Chile is that these assessments have a great capacity to change and to alter teachers' sense of control, and the interviews also show how teachers feel disempowered in a system with flexible work arrangements, which is also important to highlight, that also the teacher regulatory regime is organized as a market, and this also adds pressure to teachers in a context of high stakes accountability. So schools in Chile are expected to engage in constant improvement cycles, and to promote school improvement, they have public funding to hire consultants. That can be university consultants, but also private consultants, and there's a lot of public money for this purpose. So what we see is that there's an educational improvement industry as a very important, powerful constituency in Chile to maintain this system going on. Of course, the school performance data is still systematically published. Public opinion is usually supporting this type of data as a proxy of educational quality, but also we see increasing organized resistance, and that in the context of post-pandemic and a progressive government have started introducing some consideration for reform, but is not crystallizing yet. So this is what we observe in Chile. In Norway, we have a different story. Okay? In Norway, performance-based accountability, large-scale assessments were discussed as a possibility since the 80s, but it was not until the 2000s that a performance-based accountability framework is being adopted, and this event was precipitated by the poor results or the unsatisfactory results of Norway in the first volume of PISA. So this generated a sort of PISA shock. It wasn't like Norway was not doing well looking at the country average, but it was not doing as expected in comparison to other Nordic countries. And there is a famous statement of the Minister of Education at that time that was saying that PISA was like coming from the Winter Olympic Games without a medal. So this was the level of the PISA shock that precipitated a very what teachers perceived as a very interventionist PBI system that challenged a long legacy of trust in teacher professionalism. This generated a lot of unrest, even demonstrations and collective action asking for a moratorium. And teachers, through their collective bodies, were able to regain control over the accountability system and to give them a more reflexive approach and to participate in the design of the national assessment. So in a way, they were able to regain control and to give accountability a different goal. Instead of control, it was more about a reflexive accountability approach. And it's true that accountability has been also attenuated by this professional control, the role of principals in a more collegial educational system. But it's true that local governments, and especially local media, through the publication of school rankings, covering successful cases of schools and failing schools regularly, are also contributing to make this assessment to put a lot of reputational pressure. So the local media has emerged as an unexpected account holder that is altering the intended meaning of assessments. And finally, in Catalonia, in Spain, what we find is a very different rationale. So national assessments are adopted as a way to modernize the governance of the educational system, to introduce more transparency, to promote an evaluation culture that was very, very weak, outcomes-based management. There is a less explicit political goal that was also to counterbalance what governments saw as a very high level of de facto teacher autonomy. But it's true that this policy was implemented without insufficient administrative capacity, without generating an independent agency, without communicating well this policy to schools, and we can consider that this policy instruments have not been able to neutralize this long legacy of bureaucratic centralism. There is a lot of opposition, back and forth political dynamics, changes in government or economic junctures make this policy to be discontinued, recontinued, and also schools, basically because they don't understand this policy very well or is changing so constantly, they tend to see accountability as paperwork and hardly triggering dynamics of data use. But what is also true is that despite the system is low stakes and being adopted by a diagnostic function, sometimes is perceived by schools as high stakes, and this is basically because of the role of school inspectors. The school inspectors are using assessment data to evaluate the schools, something that is not initially designed, but for them, using assessment data is a way to make their work easier. So it's a way that they can have a proxy of how schools are doing without having to talk to teachers, going into the classroom. So inspectors are becoming a main instrument constituency in the supporting large-scale assessments, basically for professional reasons, not for political, not for economic reasons, but for professional reasons. And I have some survey data showing also how schools perceive these policies differently, with Chile feeling more performance pressure, with the schools in Chile being more mandated to improve and to train national assessments in the classroom compared to the other two countries, although, as you can see, Catalonia is also experiencing high pressure relatively for the policy framework that, as I said, is very low stakes. Teaching to the test is also very frequent in Chile, more than in the other two countries, but also very high in Catalonia. interviews in Chile, I am happy to share them with you. They constantly express this stress that teachers experience, how they assume that good results in the test is a synonym of being a good teacher, and teaching in the courses where SIMCE, that is the national assessment, is being implemented is like having a stone in the chest. Data use dynamics are also very different. In Chile, data use is usually has a more instrumental purpose to compare performance with other schools, to build a school reputation, to assess teachers' work, which makes sense in a market context as the one I was describing. And another, I think, interesting characteristic of Norway is that data use has a focus on improving equity, addressing learning gaps, and it's not so important for professional development decisions to promote a school improvement plan, which makes sense in a more professionalized teaching context. So interviews in Norway also show this idea of how the profession has reappropriated the instrument. So they admit that tests have got better, that they use the results of the national assessment to reflect on their practice, and if they put some pressure, it's like self-imposed pressure, not because they feel pressure from the principal or an external agency. And in Spain, what we see more clearly is a case of decoupling. So a lot of teachers were telling us that they don't think that these instruments are useful for them, that they already know how their students are doing. They even admit in the interviews and informally that they do a lot of cheating the day of the national assessment is being implemented. So it's a very clear case of decoupling a structure from practice. So and now to conclude, I hope that I have been able to reinforce this idea of policy change being a multidimensional phenomenon that can be triggered by multiple factors, and that the theories that aim to explain policy change need to rely on different factors, different mechanisms, because if not, they are condemned to fail, especially in increasingly complex societies and educational systems. So global education reform discourses may be globalizing, but crystallizing very different policy change patterns. This is something that different scholars have shown, but I hope that I have also shown this to you through the different causal narratives of the three countries I was telling you about. So in our case, the mechanism-based explanations do not imply identifying causal mechanisms that are universal in nature, that apply everywhere, have effects in any circumstance, but the trajectories relies on different mechanisms. In Chile, we have seen this cumulative pattern of different rationales of instrument choice that is putting incremental pressure on teachers, and how there is an instrument constituency in the form of a school improvement industry. In Norway, PBA is first of all is a reaction to an external shock, but teachers regain control through their strong institutional autonomy over the system. But here, a different instrument constituency in the form of local media emerges, and in Catalonia, Spain, what we see is that the policy is there, but insufficient capacity and poor community with targeted population to implement it. And the main instrument constituency are the school inspectors that use assessment data to evaluate the schools, which is something that are not designed for. And yeah, finally, I hope that I was successful in showing that the mechanisms cannot be isolated from the context where they emerge. So causal mechanisms vary also because of the context, or the effectiveness and the nature of causal mechanisms can be contingent, in our case, to administrative regimes, but also to different models of teacher regulation, and is the combination of these elements the one that makes policy trajectories maybe not unique, but at least highly idiosyncratic. And also at the implementation level, I think it's important to say that the logics of, in this case, national assessment instrumentation, the rationales of instrument choice, also influence implementation patterns. And not only the real implementation, but also how school actors perceive these policies and how experience pressure from these policies. So this can generate what we call this feedback loop. So in the long run, the implementation pattern can feed back into the policy framework, either reinforcing stability or challenging the statu quo. So I hope that with this presentation I have invited you to conduct mechanism-based explanations, and above all, don't forget your hand lens, and thank you very much.